Good afternoon, and welcome to the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary University of London. It's wonderful to see you here on this, the 30th anniversary of the Downing Street Declaration, a key moment in the history of the Northern Ireland peace process that was signed on the 15th of December 1993 by John Major and Albert Reynolds. Over the next hour, we're going to be thinking about how this came about, why it matters, and where it sits in the history of Northern Ireland and of the peace process. To do that, we're joined by two very special guests. So joining me from down the corridor here at Queen Mary is Martin Frampton, who is the Professor of Modern History here at QM. He is the author of Talking to Terrorists, The Search for Peace in Northern Ireland and the Basque Country, The Long March on the Political Strategy of Sinn Féin, and Legion of the Rearguards, about Irish dissident republicanism, and all of those make the perfect Christmas gifts for all the family. And we're delighted to be joined from Oxford University by Dr. Eleanor Williams. Dr. Williams is a junior research fellow in the Northern Ireland Peace Process based at Pembroke College. And she's part of a fabulous research project, which is run by the Quill programme, called Writing Peace, Penning the Good Friday Agreement. And that's digitising and analysing thousands of documents relating to the peace process. We're going to put a link to that in the chat box, and we're looking forward to hearing some of the fruits of that project today. If you have any questions for our panelists, please do post them in the chat or in the Q&A. We'd love to hear from you, and I will try and put your questions to our speakers. So welcome to both our guests, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with the basics. So, Martin, could you set the scene for us? What does Northern Ireland look like in the early 90s, and where are we in the history of the Troubles?
Okay, thanks, Rob. I'll do my best to, as I said before we started, kind of offer a quick 2-minute explainer on the conflict for the uninitiated. So, the Downing Street Declaration was a key element in what became known as the Northern Irish Peace Process, an attempt to solve a long-running civil conflict within Northern Ireland that had been going since the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s. There's lots we could say about that conflict itself, known euphemistically as the Troubles. Really, it turned on two interlocking questions, two constitutional questions, essentially. The first was, should the territory of Northern Ireland be part of the United Kingdom or part of a united Ireland? And on this, the population of Northern Ireland was basically split between two more or less coherent communities. On the one hand, a community of largely Protestants who wished for Northern Ireland to be part of the UK, and they represented somewhere between 2/3 and 55% of the population by the time the conflict begins. And on the other hand, a fairly substantial Catholic minority, who most of whom believed in the Irish nationalist vision. So we'd refer to the first group as Unionists or Loyalists, the second group as Nationalists or Republicans, in the sense that they wanted an independent Irish republic. So we see this population divided on political, religious lines, and that division dates back to the 19th century, and we definitely don't have time to go into all that. So that kind of key division on the status of Northern Ireland definitely underpins the conflict. The second question that I alluded to is a kind of subsidiary question, but was the question of how should the territory be governed? And since the creation of Northern Ireland, it had been run through a devolved parliament within so in 1920, Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom. It's run by devolved government, elected by first past the post democracy. And it's the trigger for the conflict, really, is the outworking, actually, of that political situation, that the Catholic minority suffered a number of injustices, discrimination, at the hands of the majority unionist government over the 50 years of the existence of Northern Ireland from 1920 down to 1972. It's worth stressing that in that period, Northern Ireland was a democratic country in the sense that it had regular elections. But as my former colleague Richard Burke has kind of made clear in a very good book on the conflict, you know, it's one of the functions of first past the post democracy in particular in a communally divided society that democratic elections make effectively for one-party government, and that's what you had. So Northern Ireland always run by the same government, a unionist government, and that had institutionalized various forms of discrimination against the Catholic minority. So at the end of the 60s, you have this movement for civil rights, the civil rights in question being those of the Catholic minority. It meets with a violent response from the Unionist state and from the police in particular, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC. And this, if you like, ignites a kind of conflagration, an explosion of violence, which takes on quite quickly an intercommunal character. So you see Protestant versus Catholic episodes of violence on the streets. And it's against that backdrop in 1969 that the British government sends the British Army in. You actually end up in a situation where they suspend the devolved institutions. You see this rise in violence and the birth of new paramilitary organizations. Ironically, those paramilitary organizations largely defined by the first of those two constitutional questions. So a number of kind of loyalist paramilitary organizations that wished through violence to preserve the link with the Union, and a number of nationalist or Republican paramilitary groups, the most potent, most powerful of which is quickly established as the Provisional IRA, the Irish Republican Army, committed to driving out the British as they see it and to achieving Irish unity. There'd been previous iterations of the IRA dating back to the early 20th century. So the Provisional is the latest in a series of these organizations committed to achieving what they see as the unfinished revolution. And they're basically responsible for about 2/3 of the deaths in the conflict that follows. So in the subsequent 30 years, you have this, what's often called kind of low intensity conflict, but a very violent and bloody conflict in lots of ways. And the motor force for a lot of that conflict is the campaign waged by the Provisional IRA to try and achieve Irish unity, to try and achieve an Irish Republic. It mixes insurgency, urban terrorism, also the development of a political party from the 1980s, a political party called Sinn Féin, sort of grows to prominence. And the IRA and Sinn Féin wage what they call an Armalite and ballot box campaign, trying to achieve this goal. The British government, for its part, is trying to contain this violence and trying to find a political solution to this conflict. And going back to the early 70s, what the British had wanted was essentially a restored form of devolved government that would cater for minority community sensibilities. And this comes to focus on power sharing. But a key principle for the British was always that of the consent principle, so that they would not change the status of Northern Ireland unless the majority of the people within the territory wanted it to be changed. So the British are trying to produce a solution. The IRA is trying to achieve their goals. By the late 80s, early 90s, which is kind of coming towards this agreement, this declaration, you have a kind of parallel process going on, really. Ongoing violence and killing, some really brutal acts of violence, particularly as you get to the early 1990s, by paramilitaries on both sides of this divide, but also the beginnings of talks. And it's kind of out of all of that, against that backdrop, that the Downing Street Declaration comes into being.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll definitely leave the 19th century for another session, but you've really helpfully given us the backdrop there. So, Eleanor, could you introduce us to the Downing Street Declaration itself? What is it and why is it so important?
Of course. Well, Martin's set me up very nicely there. And yes, it did come out of talks, which was initiated by Father Alec Reid, John Hume, and who's the leader of the SDLP, Social Democratic and Labour Party, a nationalist, the largest nationalist party in Northern Ireland at the time, and the head leader of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams. And the result of those talks came in 1993 on the 15th of December, and it was a joint declaration by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, John Major, and the Irish Prime Minister, Albert Reynolds. And the text was broadcasted from a live press conference in Downing Street and was widely distributed in Northern Ireland, and actually the next day by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland as well. But what the declaration affirmed, like Martin mentioned, was the consent principle, that the people of Northern Ireland would decide if they if the Northern Ireland would stay part of Northern Ireland or join the Republic, but also then it was affirmed the right of the people of Ireland to self-determination. So it could be transformed to the Republic. And those two key things was key because it underpinned these big issues, these kind of ideological obstacles that were obstacles to peace in Northern Ireland. And this was important because it set the tone for the Good Friday Agreement. So people, I'm sure the audience know about the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but these key issues then were considered as nearly accepted by 1998. So the things that could have proved as big hurdles in the 1998 process were kind of taken care of in the Downing Street Declaration. But also the Downing Street Declaration's target audience, and this is perhaps why those in the audience today might not know about the Downing Street Declaration as much. The target audience for the Downing Street Declaration was the IRA and the Republican movement more broadly, so the IRA and Sinn Féin. And what the British and the Irish wanted was to show the Republican movement that there was a way forward, there was a peaceful way forward, and to try to get them to ceasefire. And this is the significant part of the Downing Street Declaration, that it did manage to get that. 8 months late, on the 31st of August 1994, the IRA called it ceasefire, and then 2 months later, in October, the Loyalist paramilitaries also declared a ceasefire. And this was a major development in the conflict and a real beginning of a constructive political process, especially for Sinn Féin, as they were able then to enter properly into a political realm.
Brilliant, thank you. So, as you said, it's interesting that this is a declaration rather than, say, a law or a treaty, and so you have to think about who the intended audience is and how they respond to it. But let's wind back the clock then and think about how we get to this point. So, Martin, our story ends in Downing Street, but it's often seen, I think, as beginning with talks between the nationalist parties in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. Could you tell us something about those talks and why they matter?
Yeah, and it involves a kind of cast of characters, some of whom Eleanor has already alluded to. Sort of at the end of my previous remarks, I mentioned that by the late 80s, you had this parallel process essentially going on. Ongoing violence and killing, some of it very bloody, some of it very brutal, particularly by the IRA. Just 6 weeks before the Downing Street Declaration, the IRA committed what was widely seen as one of the worst atrocities that it had carried out during the conflict, when it bombed a fish and chip shop on the Shankill Road in West Belfast. It was trying to kill leaders of the Loyalist paramilitary organisation, the UFF. It failed to do that, mostly killed sort of innocent civilians. In retaliation for that, Loyalist paramilitaries then infamously attacked a pub on Halloween at a small town, a village, Greysteel, famously shouting kind of trick or treat as they walked through the door and spraying the bar with gunfire. So many at the time were saying Northern Ireland seemed to be kind of on the precipice of civil war, kind of an escalation beyond even where it had got to in terms of violence. So for many, it looked very bleak. And yet beneath the surface, if you like, we can see in retrospect that there were these signs, these potential openings, these potential for change. And definitely a key part of that were shifts going on within the Irish Republican movement, of which the IRA was a part, and shifts more broadly within the Irish nationalist family. And a key figure within that process of change is the person of Gerry Adams that Eleanor mentioned. He was the president of Sinn Féin, the dominant figure in Irish republicanism, certainly since the mid to late 70s, always denied, of course, that he was a member of the IRA, but was widely understood to, in a sense, speak for them. Alongside him, Martin McGuinness. And I think Adams and McGuinness were kind of crucial in Irish Republican terms because they could speak for the movement in the key urban cockpits of Northern Ireland, if you like, Belfast and Derry. Key figures they were seen in terms of being in the IRA leadership. And there was a sense that this leadership had, over the course of the 80s, come to feel that their arms struggle wasn't delivering, that it wasn't perhaps likely to deliver the end goals. A kind of slow process of awareness of that fact, I think. And so they begin to search for an alternative. And I think Gerry Adams arrives at this point probably sooner than most of his colleagues. I mean, one of the interesting things about this burgeoning process is the way in which Adams is maneuvering some of his colleagues towards kind of accepting a peace process and eventually an IRA ceasefire. But one of the ways he's doing that is exploring the alternatives. So he's reaching out to other people, as you say, within the Irish nationalist family. He's very close to this priest in West Belfast, Father Alec Reid, and he uses the priest, Father Alec Reid, as a conduit, as a gate, a kind of easily deniable conduit. Reid can go and speak to mainstream politicians in a way that Adams at that point could not. So he uses Reid to reach out to the leader of Fianna Fáil, Charlie Haughey, at that time in the 80s, and also to John Hume, who was the leader of the SDLP, which was the kind of non-violent nationalist party supported by Catholic nationalists in Northern Ireland. So Adams begins this process of kind of putting out feelers, and out of that you get, from sort of 88, a succession of conversations that Adams has with John Hume. And one of their ideas is, would it be possible for the British government to produce some kind of declaration that would open the way to more sort of a non-violent political path? That could this be the gateway to persuading the IRA to laying down their weapons? They produced their own declaration. So talks begin in 88. They cool off for a bit. They kind of reignited around 1990, 91. Over the next couple of years, Hume and Adams secretly, this is all happening in secret, kind of no one knows, are meeting semi-regularly. Members of their parties are meeting, and they put together their own declaration, which is very different from the Downing Street Declaration, it should be said. So their declaration basically looks to a much more Irish Republican style of solution. So it imagines that eventually there will be Irish unity, that the British government will help persuade unionists to accept Irish unity, and certainly in at least a couple of iterations of their declaration, it imagines that the British will kind of give us a time frame by which they will leave Northern Ireland. So their hope is that if the British government will say this, that will provide a context in which the IRA will stop. Obviously, that very much cuts against some of those key elements that were essential to British policy going back to the 70s, and in particular, which Eleanor again mentioned, the consent principle, right? So that the status of Northern Ireland will not be changed without the democratic consent of the majority of the people. So as you approach, in the backdrop to the actual issuing of the agreement, the declaration itself, you've got this kind of question of different texts in play, and how will the British and the Irish governments respond to this Hume-Adams declaration? Eventually, John Hume takes his declaration basically to the Irish government, which is then under the Taoiseach Albert Reynolds. He'd replaced Charlie Haughey, and Reynolds agrees that he will take that to Major. But for all the reasons I've just said, Major kind of takes one look at that Hume-Adams declaration and says, this isn't going to fly. And so then the work begins on, well, how do you come up with something that builds on the momentum you've begun to establish, that as news of this process has sort of entered the public domain in late 93, and it happens because John Hume is photographed coming out of, I think, Martin McGuinness's house, or one way or the other in Derry. So there's kind of people begin to get an inkling that something is going on here, and that raises expectations. And of course, many people are just desperate to see peace, an end to the conflict. So the governments sort of think, okay, well, how can we harness that energy, that momentum, but perhaps push it in a different direction?
So you touched there on the role of Gerry Adams trying to steer republicanism in a slightly different direction. You also mentioned the figure of John Hume as leader of the SDLP. And this is somebody who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, along with David Trimble. Does he, at this point, do you think, have a vision of how peace is going to come about?
I mean, Hume for a long time had, been making the case against IRA violence. I mean, so Hume had put forward a number of arguments, if you like, against why the IRA should be carrying out the kinds of actions that it was carrying out. And he'd helped develop a language, a set of concepts, if you like, for reframing the conflict, and that he felt could provide a path to peace. So for Hume, famously, he said, the divisions of Northern Ireland and Ireland more broadly were not divisions of territory, they were divisions of people. And that if you wanted to have a new Ireland, this would have to be an agreed Ireland between the peoples, and that you couldn't coerce anyone to accept, for example, Irish unity. Equally, you couldn't coerce, if you like, the Catholic minority to just accept the status quo as it had been before 1972. So for Hume, he put a big premium on consent, and had done a lot, I think, to kind of recast the language of Irish nationalism. I mean, one of the big things I alluded to earlier that's happening, I think, is a kind of opening of old shibboleths, a kind of a willingness to revise some of the core assumptions of Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism. And Hume is a big part of that. And it's his, so A, he's sort of doing that at the intellectual level, but B, also, when the time came, Hume could see the value in trying, if you like, to create a bridge to Gerry Adams and trying to create a bridge to Irish Republicans. And he took huge amounts of criticism for that. You know, he was always under threat from loyalists anyway. But yeah, received a ton of criticism for when it was revealed that he was talking to Gerry Adams at a point when Gerry Adams was still very much beyond the pale. So Hume has this kind of crucial, I think, both intellectual and practical role in making the peace process possible and creating this opportunity, this pathway into a peace process for Irish Republicans.
Eleanor, to what extent are the two governments aware of these talks? Are there sort of back channels of their own in play?
Well, it's actually quite interesting that you mentioned John Hume's role, because John Hume was actually, so a bit of context, by the end of Thatcher's time in government, she kind of gives up a bit on Northern Ireland, and she tells her Secretary of State, Peter Brook, gives him a bit of freedom, do as you like. She has no ideas anymore. And out of that, John Hume suggests to Peter Brook a lot of the language regarding the Whitbread speech, the famous Whitbread speech of November 1990. And this speech basically says that the British government has no selfish, strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And this statement, perhaps not particularly exciting for the average citizen, was designed to get the attention of the Republican movement. And this statement was given or suggested to Peter Brook by John Hume because he knew what would get the Republican movement's attention, and it certainly did. And perhaps then encouraged by this initial success, because it was given a bit of a cautious welcome by the Republican movement in circles, that John Hume then decided, oh, hang on, like Martin mentioned, let's write a bit of a joint declaration and see how far that goes. So regarding that kind of back channels, the British were also, as well as John Hume was working with Alec Reid and Gerry Adams to get the nationalist side on board, the British then were also working with John Hume to see what steps they could do moving forward. And then, like Martin mentioned, that John Hume wrote the first draft of the joint declaration, but there were 20-something drafts by the end.
Right.
So the British then were through different back channels and working with the Irish government, providing on different levels. Sometimes they would only discuss the drafts. By the end, they were fully drafting them. So there were many different channels where this draft was going through. People like Jim Molyneux so the leader of the UUP, were also providing different drafts. So there's a lot of fingers in the pie regarding that during this time. And a lot of it, again, like Martin mentioned, a lot of it happening covertly because there were so many key characters from very differing backgrounds, which would have been completely controversial. And that was something that John Major was particularly concerned about. He really wanted to put Northern Ireland on the front burner when he came into office, but he was always, especially because of his small minority, he was always quite concerned about the unionist backlash and the political repercussions of these channels.
So we've got all of these sort of parallel conversations going on, often, as you say, covert and deniable. And from the early 90s, we've got new leadership in London and in Dublin. We've got John Major in power from December 1990, Albert Reynolds, I think, from 1992. Is that change of leadership important, do you think?
Definitely. I think the change of approach first by Margaret Thatcher, I will give it that definitely brings a more power to the Secretary of State and more power to the civil servants to think a bit more creatively, especially in the Northern Ireland office, that they were given a bit more freedom to think more creatively. People like Quentin Thomas, John Chilcott in the Northern Ireland office, that they had a bit more freedom to think more creatively about the problem and the Northern Ireland problem. But yes, there was definitely a shift in I think Major was a massive and significant shift during this period. I mean, John Major had much less unionist baggage than Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher had been the target of IRA attacks continuously, but also John Major was much more of a natural negotiator. He had a much more open perspective in Northern Ireland due to the lack of unionist baggage, but also then he was able to have a much more constructive and positive working relationship with the Irish Taoiseach and the Irish team that he had, which Margaret Thatcher didn't always have, especially with Charlie Haughey after his remarks on the Falklands War. That that relationship was never particularly successful. So I think the 1990s really brings that transition period. Obviously, when you get to Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, that's another very successful relationship. But I do think this was a great stepping stone in the British-Irish relations improving during that period.
I was struck the other day, I was watching the press conference at which John Major and Albert Reynolds announced the declaration. And if any of our viewers want to find it, it's on YouTube. And it's very striking. I don't want to say it's dull, but there's certainly something rather sort of unthreatening and almost slightly colourless about the presentation. I wonder if that's part of the secret here, that we've got some slightly less spiky characters.
I think that's a very good analysis of it. And I think even on the kind of unionist side, people like Jim Molyneux was much less charismatic. So he was the leader of the UUP, and he was much less charismatic.
The Unionist, Ulster Unionist Party.
Yes, Ulster Unionist Party, so the main unionist party in Northern Ireland at the time. And he was, number one, much less charismatic than Ian Paisley, but also much less charismatic than the future leaders such as David Trimble. But actually, his contribution is really interesting in the back channels. You can see how he was actually playing a very, even though from the documents, his views seem very mundane, but what things that he was particularly concerned about as a unionist and giving a unionist voice was he's fine with the idea of self-determination and a referendum, but he was really concerned about where the referendum was going to be and how it would be conducted. And through tediously going through the documents, that's how you get the idea of a referendum in Northern Ireland and another referendum in the Republic of Ireland. And I think the fact that he wasn't very ambitious, very charismatic, meant that he didn't, well, he chose not to score political points. It would have been very easy for him to go and leak the declarations to the press. This would have scored him major political points in the unionist community, but also then afterwards, when Ian Paisley was regarding the Downing Street Declaration, so Ian Paisley, the leader of the DUP, the other unionist party, but he was regarding the Downing Street Declarations as sellout. Jim Molyneux and the UUP could have easily done that as well, but they chose not to. And I think these more mundane, strong characters are particularly interesting. The strength of the Downing Street Declaration, actually. Yes, a particular fan of the more mundane characters.
Well, we're going to come back to Ian Paisley shortly, but I want to bring Martin back in at this point because we've been talking here about individuals, and you've talked about Gerry Adams and John Hume, and we've just been talking about John Major and Albert Reynolds. But I suppose historians are often quite wary of putting too much emphasis on great individuals. So I wonder, are there bigger social or economic changes happening at this time that might be conducive to peace in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, and you know, by the late 80s, early 90s, you've obviously got a world that's changing very rapidly. You've got a sense within Northern Ireland of a conflict that's drifting, of the IRA, I think, increasingly looking almost kind of out of time. That its position is corroding as well. That the actions of the security services could not prevent all sort of IRA attacks, but particularly within Northern Ireland itself, they were finding it harder and harder to sort of prosecute the campaign that they wished. As I say, you've got this sort of wider zeitgeist of change, the end of the Cold War, the onset of peace processes in South Africa and Israel-Palestine as was. That sort of moment of optimism looks a long time ago now, but at the time there was sort of hope, obviously around first the Madrid conference and then Oslo, that even that supposedly intractable conflict could be solved. So you've got this sense, I think, of change. And I think that does feed into or reinforces those who wanted to look at things anew. As I say, I think people like Gerry Adams had already kind of earlier in the decade, early in the sort of near the end, beginning of the 80s, and sort of arrived at a view that something had to give, that the IRA campaign actually could not just keep going as it had done. And he's beginning to think of alternatives. But yeah, there is this broader sense, I think, of an era of change. It's particularly, of course, the case within the Irish Republic, that, you know, you've got by the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, you've got the early years of the Celtic Tiger, a new relationship between Ireland and Europe, the collapse of the authority of the Catholic Church. And I think all of that sort of comes together to a kind of to burnish those who want to revise, as I said, the kind of the old shibboleths, particularly the old nationalist, religious shibboleths of kind of Irish identity and Irish nationalism. And that creates openings, people ready to revisit. And actually, just to pick up on something I think Eleanor alluded to, and I think you were alluding to, Rob, with your previous question, you know, that you have this this moment with the declaration of the British Prime Minister and the Irish Taoiseach standing next to each other. It does seem to mark a kind of new era of British-Irish partnership. And now we can trace that back to the mid-80s, actually, when you have the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I mean, in a sense, the path to the Downing Street Declaration, you could track it through various pieces of paper and agreements and political initiatives over the previous 2 decades. And yet, in the post-Anglo-Irish Agreement world, so this was an agreement signed in 1985 between the two governments, which inaugurated a kind of new era of partnership in trying to handle Northern Ireland. And I think the Downing Street Declaration is one of the fruits of that new partnership that comes into being. An attempt to kind of lower the temperature. So whereas in the past, particularly in the early 70s, Northern Ireland had been a real sort of point of friction between the two governments, that those in London tended to think that within Dublin they weren't doing enough to stop the IRA, and in some cases they argued, you know, were perhaps even sympathetic to the IRA campaign, that they supported the aims of the IRA in achieving Irish unity. I think by the time it gets to the late 80s, early 90s, the successive governments in Dublin, and, you know, and to some extent I would include the governments of Hockey in that as well, have sort of made it clear that they aren't interested in that. And actually what they want is to see a solution, a political solution that brings peace to the area. And to that end, they're willing to work closely with the British government, and the British government too being open to that. And as I say, this is something that goes back to the Thatcher era. So yeah, I think that new Anglo-Irish partnership, of which the Declaration is a key exemplar, is part of those wider changes.
And you've touched there on the role of Europe. Just briefly, is there any role here for European integration, either in terms of some direct involvement of the European community, or in terms of, you know, a place where British and Irish ministers and civil servants meet, or in terms of changing the thinking around borders?
Yeah, I mean, I think both the practical level, you're absolutely right. The kind of ever, at that point, closer integration in Europe definitely promotes cooperation between ministers, between officials in particular. I think that's really important. You get officials in both London and Dublin who are used to working with each other. Also, you know, by the early 90s, you've got a context of moving towards, you know, the Single European Act, towards Maastricht, closer European integration, the idea of breaking down borders. It reinforces the efforts of those like John Hume, what I said about him earlier, those who want to imagine things differently, who want to kind of take an old concept like Irish self-determination and sort of transform the meaning in a sense. You know, is there a way in which you can break down the borders in Ireland in ways that, yeah, depart from traditional nationalist visions, and perhaps provide a context for providing a solution to this conflict that looks different from what had previously been imagined. So yeah, I think the changes that are happening in terms of Europe are absolutely part of that context.
So we've been thinking here about the things that might be promoting conciliation or peace, but we should also be talking about continuing disagreement and conflict. And Eleanor, I suppose that brings us to Ian Paisley. On the day of the declaration, I think Ian Paisley is in Downing Street, accusing the government of treachery. Can you tell us a little bit about Ian Paisley and what it is that he's so concerned about in this declaration?
Definitely. I think Ian Paisley is without a doubt one of the most interesting characters of the Northern Ireland conflict and peace process. And yes, you're definitely right. He was not happy with the Downing Street Declaration, to say the least. And he did regard it as treachery and a sellout. And I think one of the parts that the DUP and Ian Paisley particularly was concerned about was the idea of self-determination, that if the majority of people in Northern Ireland, along with the Republic of Ireland, decided that it could become united, then that was now a possibility. It was in writing. And anything for especially hardline unionists that took them closer to United Ireland was a great concern. They were particularly historically very concerned about London always selling them out, that they would always sell out the unionist community. And it's very different. So the UUP, Ulster Unionist Party, the largest unionist party, was part of the consultation of the joint declaration, Jim Molyneux could provide feedback on different drafts and highlight stuff that he wasn't happy with. Ian Paisley didn't have such a role in the declaration. So I suppose in that sense, the UUP weren't going to denounce it as much. But historically, this was Ian Paisley's role when there were different agreements and declarations. So in 1973, you had the Sunningdale Agreement, which was regarded as, you might have seen the saying Dublin is only a Sunningdale away, meaning that they thought, oh, this is going to lead to United Ireland. Martin mentioned the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, one of the first agreements between the Irish and British, and brought an Irish dimension into Northern Ireland, and that they cooperate on stuff like security. And that's where you have Ian Paisley's very famous never, never, never speech in City Hall. So this was not surprising that Ian Paisley was going to react in such a way, but yes, the idea that self-determination was now in writing that was what would have concerned him, but also more hardline unionists as well.
And of course, John Major himself is the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. How big a political risk was he taking, do you think, in potentially destabilising his party's relationship with unionism, especially given he had a tiny majority up to 1992?
Yes, I think you're definitely right in highlighting the political risk he took with this agreement. So like I mentioned, that when he came into power, he put Northern Ireland on the front burner. This was something that he wanted to designate a lot of his time at, even though really politically there's not much gain for British prime ministers to deal with Northern Ireland. It's not going to get you many political points for solving peace in Northern Ireland, unfortunately. And he was always concerned about the unionist reaction, the fallout, and yes, especially with if the leaks and that he'd been dealing with John Hume and Sinn Féin, if that came out, there would be a political risk. And I think it was more of a political risk for John Major compared to Tony Blair. I'm not saying Tony Blair didn't take a risk at all, but the shift in Thatcher's approach to Major's approach was a big step. Thatcher was much more hardline, where Major then decided to take the initiative and talk to them through channels. And I'm not saying Blair didn't take a risk, but Blair had a much larger majority. Blair's party didn't have the unionist baggage that the Conservatives had. And as well, the Labour Party hadn't been a constant target by the IRA for attacks. So it was much less personal with Labour, even though it would have been very difficult. But also Blair had the benefit that it was common knowledge by the time that he came as Prime Minister that John Major had been dealing with the IRA. So it was, in that sense, John Major had ripped off that band-aid in that sense. Again, obviously, Tony Blair took it much further steps by shaking Gerry Adams' hands, inviting the Sinn Féin delegation to Downing Street. But I do think Major's risks and the steps he took has been underrated in history.
And it's remarkable to think that it's only, a couple of years since the IRA had tried to assassinate John Major with the mortar attack on the Cabinet Office. On that point, Martin, you've written a book on talking to terrorists. And John Major famously said just a few months before the declaration that it would turn his stomach to sit down and talk with Mr. Adams and the Provisional IRA. And then, of course, a few weeks later, it's revealed that the British government is indeed talking with Adams. Did John Major lie to Parliament when he said that? And how controversial was that moment, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in a very technical sense, no, he did not. I mean, he very carefully picked his words carefully. He said it would turn his stomach to talk to Adams, I think is the quote, right? He doesn't say he's not doing. And actually, at that point, they're not talking directly to Adams. So just to take a step back, I mean, you allude to the book that we wrote, Talking to Terrorists. So, I mean, the reason we called our book that is because I think a huge amount has been written about how do governments, how do states deal with this kind of insurgency, this kind of whatever word you want to use. And it tends to put a premium on the need to engage with these actors in order to achieve political solution. And the argument we were making in that book really was that it's a mistake to argue that the act of talking in and of itself can be a kind of silver bullet, that it's a kind of singularly transformative act which changes everything. the book actually begins by saying, governments always talk to terrorists. This happens time and again in these kinds of conflicts. The British had actually talked to the IRA repeatedly throughout the conflict. And on occasions that they'd made it work, the act of talking had made things worse. So most clearly in 1972, very early on, the IRA calls a ceasefire. Its leadership, including a very young Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, are flown to London for talks with the Secretary of State. It doesn't really go anywhere. And in the aftermath of the IRA, sort of take the lesson that the fact that the British were willing to talk to them shows the British are weakening, their resolve is weakening. So one big push will solve things. And out of that, you get Bloody Friday, sort of IRA blitz on Belfast in July 72. So big escalation of violence. There's other episodes in kind of the mid-70s, which sort of reveal, I think, that the very act of talking to terrorists in and of itself doesn't necessarily change that much. It's certainly not always productive. So the key question is, why does it work when it does in the 1990s? And that's where we then go back to that kind of wider context. The backdrop, as you've alluded to the Downing Street Declaration, you have these secret back-channel communications between British officials and obviously senior members in the IRA, and it's run through intermediaries. And there's been a couple of good books on this recently, books that I would disagree in some sense with the interpretation, but very informative and kind of valuable books by scholars like Neil O'Doherty and the journalist Peter Taylor on what was this back channel, which was known as Operation Chiffon and run by MI5, MI6. There's an interesting thing I think to think about, which is, how does that back channel process, which is secret, but then is revealed, as you say, in November 1993, and it provides the context for John Major saying those words, how does that intersect with the Downing Street Declaration? And I think, when you look closely at it, there's a sense that back channel can only go so far, and it stalls on the question of, will the IRA actually call a ceasefire? Will that ceasefire be permanent? What should be the consequences in terms of the readiness of the state to talk to the IRA and under what conditions, and what will be the involvement of the wider parties? And all of those issues are unresolved, really. And what the Downing Street Declaration, I think, is doing then is kind of bringing everything into the open and trying to provide clear answers to those questions that allow all of the parties in Northern Ireland to buy into. And the wider significance, actually, of the declaration is that it's not about talking to terrorists. This is about bringing things into the political mainstream and creating a democratic, open basis for a viable political process, which is what emerges and what leads you towards the Good Friday Agreement. The declaration itself, we've not said much actually about the declaration, but I mean, the actual text of it, we're not going to bore people with sort of verbatim quotes, I think, of the declaration, but it is, I mean, there's some remarkable stuff in there. It's a kind of masterful piece of drafting, which draws together key ideas that have been circulating. Eleanor mentioned, like Peter Brook, he'd sort of come up with this formulation about the British government having no selfish strategic interest in Northern Ireland. That's in the agreement, in the declaration. That idea about concurrent referenda, that's all in the declaration, but framed in such a way as trying to provide a bridge for Irish Republicans to then engage with this political process, but to do so on terms that would not alienate the wider political community. So wouldn't alienate the unionist parties, wouldn't alienate Jim Molyneux and others. So yeah, that's the work that this declaration is trying to do. It's actually trying to move you beyond a situation where the government has, in some senses, been talking to terrorists, but trying to recast this in a much broader political context.
Well, on exactly that point, Eleanor, you've been, as part of the Quill project, you've been going through all the different versions of the declaration, all those drafts and redrafts and the text being put in and taken out and put back in again. What were the most contentious issues in the drafting of the declaration?
That's a very good point. Yes. Well, I think the two most significant parts of the declaration is the idea that you have the consent principle, that the Republican movement actually accept that they are no longer going to be using violent means to push their own political agendas, but also then the right to self-determination. I think those two things are the two things that are most important, but also like the Peter Brook statement, that is in the Downing Street Declaration. And the fact then that that is said by a UK Prime Minister is quite significant. They take the word political out in the Downing Street Declaration because they don't want to say that the British Prime Minister has no interest whatsoever in Northern Ireland. But the fact is that they say that they have no selfish or strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland is very significant. And I think the success of the Downing Street Declaration is that it addresses the major ideological obstacles to the Northern Ireland peace process, that the two governments take the big obstacles off the table nearly. So when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement, things like the right of people to self-determination, principle of consent, shows that the political differences can be negotiated and resolved exclusively by political means. So it's not making the Good Friday Agreement easy at all, by no means, but it's taking a massive step forward. So I do think those two things are the most significant, but also those two things are the most, especially the self-determination, is the most significant thing to get the attention of the Republican movement and push them forward to that ceasefire.
Can I come in on that, Rob? I completely agree with what Eleanor said in terms of the significance of that language. And so this is a 12-paragraph document, and that a lot of that is in paragraph 4, which is the longest paragraph. And it brings together these, very clever formulations that are kind of reuniting self-determination with consent. But I would add as well, the other kind of key bit for me, I think, in the declaration is paragraph 10, which is one of the shorter bits. But, this says that the achievement of peace must involve a permanent end to the use of or support for paramilitary violence. And this question of would violence end and how long would IRA violence have to end for was basically the issue that had sunk the kind of back channel communication. And it goes on to say that if there is this permanent end of violence, democratically mandated parties which establish a commitment to exclusively peaceful methods and which have shown that they abide by the democratic process are free to participate fully in democratic politics and to join in dialogue, etc., etc. And I think this is the key framework, if you like, that it's saying to the IRA and to Sinn Féin, if the violence ends and you commit to exclusively peaceful means, then there is a way forward for you. We will allow you to be included, but the violence has to end permanently, and you have to have exclusively peaceful means. And again, this goes back to the heart of this, what happens when governments talk to terrorists? Those who've been most ardent in kind of promoting that as some kind of silver bullet solution to political conflict often sort of make the secondary argument that you should talk without preconditions. For me, one of the key aspects of the Downing Street Declaration is there are clear preconditions here. This is not an anything goes kind of talks process. The key emphasis is, yes, you can be included, but the violence has to end and you have to commit to exclusively peaceful methods. And much of what's at stake and up for contention in the years that follow the Downing Street Declaration is the question of, well, has the IRA ended violence permanently, and has it committed to exclusively peaceful methods? And that's kind of the issue. So, yeah, I would sort of add that bit as also kind of crucial for everything that comes next.
And as I think that brings out, although this is quite a short document, the precise wording is so important, and that's obviously why there are so many different drafts. Eleanor, who is actually doing this drafting? Who is writing the document?
Well, this is a good question. A lot of this, so the British, to begin with, refuse to draft. They refuse to negotiate on drafts, but they provide comments when they receive them. So a lot of this is happening to begin with John Hume, and he goes back with a lot of Alec Reid's languages there at the beginning, with the idea of the sense of history and the British failure to resolve the conflict, and a lot of Adams' ideas are in there too. The Irish work very closely then from the beginning of 1993. The Irish really sort of escalate the process, and this is really shown in June 1993 when Reynolds actually leaves his holiday. He excuses his holiday for a day to provide Robin Butler, a British civil servant, with a draft. So that shows how much high on the agenda this was for the Irish as well. So after the British would provide a lot of the unionist perspective. They deal with Jim Molyneux, provide his text as well. But then, especially after the Anglo-Irish summit of December early December 1993. Quentin Thomas and Sean O'Higgins, so very senior civil servants on both sides, their equivalents, they do a lot of the drafting. And in the last kind of 10 days of the drafting, it's those two smashing it out nearly, trying to come to a conclusion. And they finished their drafting on the 14th of December, 1993, a day before the declaration was announced in Downing Street. So a lot of this is civil servants in the final stages as well. Very articulate and with strong legal understanding of the constitutional nature of Northern Ireland. And you can see, so if anybody wants to go on the Quill website, you can see the different discussions of where the comma is going to go and the significance of a comma. The Irish have an incredible understanding of commas. So you can see all of that from the different drafts as well. But yes, there's so many fingers in the pie from different people and from all different backgrounds. And I think that's one of the successes of the Downing Street Declaration. And again, sets a bit of the scene for the Good Friday Agreement, showing, look, all these different voices can actually be seen in a very successful document.
We've put a link to the Quill project page in the chat box, and I do recommend it to people. Do you want to just say something about what people will find if they visit Quill?
Yes, of course. So the Quill project initially began, it's a software system to understand peace documents. So it initially began understanding the American Constitution and the Australian Constitution, but we've now for the last couple of years been trying to understand the Northern Irish peace process. And we've just launched our software looking at the Downing Street Declaration. This has been done by people like Ruth Murray and Annabel Harris. And it's about getting papers, so people like Dear McNally, Monica McWilliams, John Allardyce, key people of the peace process, looking at their papers, coding them in such a way that we can see how from the initial Joint Declaration 1 all the way to Joint Declaration 20-something, and how the language is changed and altered and who's agreeing and disagreeing to what's it in bits and where they're coming from, and whether things are coming from the Whitbread speech or the Anglo-Irish Agreement or the Brooke-Mayhew talks of the early 1990s. And you can actually see, if you go on the website, if you click a certain person like Quentin Thomas, you can see every single meeting that he's ever attended and what he said, what he's objected to, agreed to. So it's a beautiful way of seeing how peace documents are created. And we're now starting in January on the Good Friday Agreement document. So watch this space.
Excellent. And if there are any students watching who are thinking about dissertation topics, I think it's a magnificent resource for a dissertation. We're coming towards the end of our time. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you both what you see as the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement. But first, Martin, there's a question I missed earlier. Member of the audience has asked, did Gerry Adams' denial of his IRA membership make it politically easier for the British government to deal with him?
Yeah, I just seen that question as well. No, I don't think so, really, because the sort of fundamental assumption that everyone made and has continued to make is that he was in the IRA and a very senior IRA figure. And I mean, part of the point of talking to Gerry Adams was the assumption that he was a senior IRA figure who could deliver the IRA, and I think that goes to the heart of kind of what the British think they're doing in engaging with him. But he's a key figure, no question. But there are others there too. You know, Martin McGuinness in this period is probably at least as important as Adams because of the support that he gives to this peace process, and certainly to many within Irish Republican circles, McGuinness was seen as the much more credible and almost like authentic figures. I mean, various books and memoirs attest to the fact that to the rank and file, McGuinness was the kind of hero, sort of legendary, seen as a hardliner, couldn't be corrupted. That was the view of him certainly at that point. Whereas there was always much more suspicion about Adams, who was always seen as a more political figure internally. So McGuinness was a kind of crucial figure working with Adams, and they very much do, you know, they operate very, very closely. It's a kind of at least a twin leadership, more of a collective leadership with others around them. And yeah, from the British perspective, I'm not sure it does make much difference, to be honest. I think, you know, the quote you mentioned earlier from John Major and others felt the same, that Gerry Adams was someone who should remain beyond the pale, and everyone assumed he was a senior figure in this organisation.
Great, thank you very much. So let's turn to the legacy. Eleanor, what do you see as the legacy of the Downing Street Declaration?
Well, I think the success of the Downing Street Declaration, and as well, everything that happened before it was the Good Friday Agreement. But I think what the Good Friday Agreement and the Downing Street Declaration also highlights is how long and significant and major peace processes are. I mean, I think the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, you can go back, like Martin mentioned, the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, but that began, the discussions of that was, you can trace that back to 1983, and that sets up the Irish dimension in Northern Irish affairs, but also Merryfield, which was a building where British and Irish civil servants could work together. And that's where you really see cooperation really beginning, bit of brainstorming about the Northern Ireland problem. And then through that, you get the Brooke Statement of 1990. You also get then the Brooke-Mayhew talks of the early 1990s. And that's where you get the three strands. And the three strands were the basis of the Good Friday negotiations. So that's what the negotiations were based on. And that comes from the early 1990s. After that, you get the Downing Street Declaration. So you can see that there's so many layers to the Good Friday Agreement that make it possible for big issues to be nearly taken off the table. Not to say that the Good Friday Agreement was inevitable or easy in any way, but it makes that you have the foundation of peace there 15 years earlier. So I think that's the kind of beauty and intricacy of the Downing Street Declaration and everything that happened before that as well, because the Downing Street Declaration didn't come from nowhere either. But yes.
Thank you. And I suppose we've talked a lot about the construction of the agreements. There's actually a question in the chat about the reception of the agreements and how the Northern Irish public responded to the declaration. And I wondered if you had if that's something that you've looked at all in the Quill project so far, or whether you have any sense of how the people of Northern Ireland are responding to this.
Well, I think compared to the Good Friday Agreement, this was meant to be a bit of an underground agreement. A lot of what the agreement, like we mentioned, a lot of it was happening covertly. So on the surface, to the average human, it just looked like another agreement by two heads of state. So compared to the Good Friday Agreement, the audience for the Downing Street Declaration at its heart was the Republican movement. Whereas the audience for the Good Friday Agreement was, number one, it needed to pass a referendum. So it needed to appeal to the people of Northern Ireland, to appeal to the Republic of Ireland. And also it was a bit of a global statement that Northern Ireland is entering a new phase. So I think amongst the unionist community, it was a bit of a dual reception. I think a lot, maybe the moderate unionists were willing to consider it, but those maybe that followed the Paisley line would not have been happy at all. But I think they would not have been happy with what the British government were doing from the Anglo-Irish to Sunningdale. So it was that kind of sense of betrayal, constant fear of betrayal. But yes, maybe Martin has more to add.
Thank you. Well, let's go to Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I probably slightly disagree on this. I think there's a kind of broader sense of optimism that it helps engender, and it raises expectations. I mean, you're right that it's aimed at the Republican movement, probably as a kind of primary audience, but I think it does have a kind of wider ripple effect, and that's significant, I think, in terms of how it's received as well within Irish republicanism. I mean, on Rob's question of, if you like, the legacy and meaning of the declaration, just to, I mean, in a sense, to repeat some of what I've said, I mean, I think what it does so effectively is it captures the momentum that had begun to build around Hugh Adams, but completely repurposes that momentum. There's a famous quote from, I can't remember the name now, but one of the senior Irish civil servants, was it senior Irish civil servant, I think, who says that there's a decision taken which is to declare Hugh Adams dead in order that the process can live, and it's that the declaration is doing, right? So it's repurposing the language and intent of Hugh Adams, but giving it a kind of grounding in the principle of consent and the kind of language that would be much more congenial to unionists, which is why people like Molyneux can sign on to it. So it's putting a democratic consent-based imperative at the heart of this sort of fledgling emergent peace process. And I think that becomes the cornerstone of what follows. As I said, the preconditions that are there are, you know, if violence permanent ends, and if you have a democratic mandate, then you can enter a talks process. And I think that becomes absolutely integral, really, to everything that happens. Precisely because of that reason, you know, this question of reception, precisely because of that reason, it goes down very badly in Irish Republican circles, that it's widely understood that rank and file members of the IRA do not support this declaration, look on it very askance or sort of dismayed, because they recognise that for all these bits of green sort of Irish nationalist supporting language, it's essentially a kind of unionist document. So it goes down very badly, but it kind of creates a trap for Gerry Adams and the leadership, which is that they've been seeking to find this political path. They've allowed this momentum to build up. They've allowed this expectation that perhaps there could be a peace process to develop. And Adams is such a kind of political animal, such a kind of clever political player. He sort of understands that the costs now of walking away from that for Sinn Féin and the IRA would be very bad, because this is popular, I think, within the sort of broad Northern Irish mainstream population. So what Adams has to do is to find a way sort of around this. So Sinn Féin famously stall. They say, oh, we're not quite sure what bits of this declaration mean. We're going to ask for clarification. They drag that process out. Eventually, a few months later in July 1994, Sinn Féin rejects the Downing Street Declaration. But kind of by that point, it doesn't matter so much because other things are in play. Adams had been able by that point to go to America. He got a visa to go and visit the United States, which was kind of very important for showing his sort of supporters that the peace process could deliver things for Irish Republicans. And the month after that the month after the rejection, the IRA declares a ceasefire. So it doesn't really matter if they reject it formally. With the actions of the ceasefire, they're joining a process that is fundamentally shaped by the declaration. And that's, to me, the kind of key legacy.
Well, it's been fascinating to listen to you both. Thank you so much to Eleanor Williams and to Martin Frampton for giving us your time and your expertise. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope that others on the call have as well. And thank you to everybody who's joined us this lunchtime. I found it fascinating and learned a lot. I hope that you have as well. Please do follow the Marlens Institute. You can sign up to our mailing list on our website. You can follow us on Twitter or X or whatever it's called this week. We've got some wonderful events coming up next year, which we'll be advertising very soon, including the historian Simon Sharma, an event to mark the centenary of the first ever Labour government. We'll be thinking about the future of the Conservative Party and issues like climate change. And we would love it if you could join us for those events, either in person or online. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to both of our speakers. And if you're the Christmassy sort, do have a Merry Christmas.